Tonight, 3 stories that all ask the same quietly dangerous question. How much are we willing to believe based on clues, when the thing we actually want to see is out of reach? A planet we can't land on, an admissions office we can't sit inside, a species that went extinct 40,000 years ago. Somebody is reading the evidence, and somebody else is reading it completely differently. Let's start about 25 million miles away. Venus, our so-called sister planet and honestly the worst neighbor in the solar system. Surface temperatures around 450 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead, an atmosphere that would crush and cook you at the same time. But a new study published in the journal Earth and Planetary Science Letters, led by Richard Gale at the University of London, argues that this hellscape may once have been a water world with oceans that, by their estimate, could have covered something like 90% of the surface. And I want to walk through their actual reasoning, because it's genuinely clever detective work. And then I want to tell you why not everyone buys it. Here's the puzzle they're working from. Huge stretches of Venus are covered in strange networks of cracks, arranged in polygons, many-sided shapes. For decades, the standard explanation was volcanic. Lava rock cools, contracts, and fractures, and you get these patterns. But Gale's team looked closer and said these don't look like cooling lava cracks. They look like something else we have right here on Earth, polygonal fault systems that form in clay-rich marine sediment on the seafloor. The way those form is oddly beautiful. Thick layers of seabed mud get buried, compacted, and squeezed like a sponge, wringing the water out. And as the mud shrinks and settles, it cracks into polygons that can stretch for kilometers. If that's what these are, then Venus had a seafloor, which means Venus had a sea, and that's only the first clue. The second is a set of enormous channels on Venus called canali. For years, people assumed those were carved by lava too, but some of them run for thousands of kilometers, which is farther than many scientists think lava could physically flow before hardening. Gale's team points out that nearly a third of the polygon fields are connected to these channels, and the channels appear to emerge from the plains with no obvious volcanic source, and then drain into deeper basins, which is exactly what you'd expect from underwater channels cut by water, not lava. Wrinkle ridges across the lowlands that they think could be sitting on top of thick layers of salt, the leftover residue of oceans that evaporated. They even do the math and estimate a salt layer that could be 60+ meters thick, and they draw the comparison to Earth's own Mediterranean, which largely dried out and left enormous salt deposits behind about 5.5 million years ago. So, polygons that look like seafloor mud, channels that look like they were cut by water, salt that looks like an evaporated ocean. Put together, it's a genuinely compelling picture. Here's where I put my critical hat on, and it's not to trash the study. It's to be honest about what it is and isn't. Every single one of those clues is an interpretation of a shape. Looks like, resembles, consistent with. Notice that language, because the scientists themselves use it carefully. And the careful ones always do. Nobody has drilled into Venus. Nobody has touched that salt or sampled that sediment. The entire case is built on reading surface features from radar data, mostly from NASA's Magellan mission, which is decades old, and saying the pattern here matches the pattern there. That is real science. It is also fundamentally circumstantial. And here's the part that most of the excited headlines leave out. The part that makes this actually interesting, instead of just a fun space fact. There is a whole other camp of scientists whose models say Venus never had oceans at all. Never. Some researchers have built climate models arguing that on early Venus, water clouds would have formed in a way that kept the planet too hot for water to ever condense into a liquid, that it went straight from a magma world to the furnace it is now, skipping the ocean phase entirely. Other modeling work has suggested that even if Venus had some water, it might have been as little as 1/10 of what Earth has, not exactly the 90% ocean water world. So you have a real, live scientific disagreement here. One team reading rocks and seeing a lost ocean. Another team running physics simulations and seeing a planet that was always bone dry. My take: this is science working exactly as it should, and the headline, Venus had oceans, is doing the study a disservice by pretending the argument is over. What we actually have is a strong new piece of evidence in a decades-old debate that won't be settled from Earth. And here's the genuinely hopeful part. It doesn't have to be. Both the European Space Agency and NASA have Venus missions in the pipeline that could map the surface at far higher resolution. And China has a proposed Venus orbiter in its Tianwen program too. This is a question with an actual answer coming. So enjoy the theory, but hold it loosely, the way the honest scientists do, until a spacecraft goes and checks. The question isn't, did Venus have oceans? It's, are we disciplined enough to wait for the data instead of falling in love with the story? Now, from a planet where we're reading rocks to guess at an invisible past, to an admissions office where the government is reading documents to prove an invisible intent. Because the second story is exactly that kind of fight. What can you infer when you can't see directly inside? Today, the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division announced findings that Duke University's law school intentionally discriminated on the basis of race in admissions, specifically for its 2023, 2024, and 2025 incoming classes. This is a serious, contested, politically charged story, so I'm going to do my best to lay out both sides as fairly and accurately as I can, and let you make up your own mind, because this one deserves that. Here's the legal backdrop. In 2023, the Supreme Court, in the case known as SFFA, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, banned race-conscious admissions in higher education. Colleges can no longer use race as a factor in who gets in. That's the law of the land now, full stop. What the court left open was that schools can still consider how an applicant's life experience or background shaped them as an individual, just not race as a category. Now here's what the DOJ says it found. According to its press release and reporting from the AP and Bloomberg, the department alleges Duke Law paid what one report called lip service to being race neutral, while using other factors as stand-ins, proxies for race. The DOJ points to things like the diversity-themed essay questions, and says reviewers were instructed to tag certain applicant characteristics that can correlate with race, and they cite outcome data. According to the letter from Assistant Attorney General Harmeet Dillon, based on 2025 applicant-level data, a black applicant had a roughly 3.5 times higher probability of admission than an equally strong Asian applicant with similar academic credentials. They also state that, in 2024 and 2025, the median LSAT scores of rejected white and Asian applicants exceeded the median LSAT scores of admitted black applicants. The DOJ's framing, in Dillon's words, was blunt. Duke doesn't get a free pass to discriminate against white and Asian students simply because it thinks it has good intentions. And here is Duke's side, because they get one. The university, in an emailed statement, said it is reviewing the letter and its conclusions carefully, and that it is committed to complying with the law and will continue to do so in a manner that is consistent with our academic mission. Notably, Duke has not conceded wrongdoing. They're reviewing the findings. And it's worth understanding the broader context. This is not a one-off. The same DOJ has recently made similar findings against the medical schools at Yale and UCLA, and announced investigations into 15 other medical schools. Supporters of the administration's campaign call this long overdue enforcement of a Supreme Court ruling that some schools are trying to quietly evade. Critics call it a politically driven pressure campaign against higher education, and would argue that using essays about someone's life experience, which the Supreme Court explicitly said was still allowed, is being recast as illegal the moment it produces a diverse class. So where's the genuinely hard question here? The one worth actually chewing on. What's the line between a proxy and a legitimate factor? The Supreme Court said you can't use race, but you can consider how someone's background shaped them. But those two things blur into each other fast. If a first-generation college student writes a powerful essay about overcoming hardship and considering that essay is legal, but the class that results happens to be more racially diverse, is that illegal discrimination, or is it exactly what the court said was still allowed? The DOJ is arguing that Duke crossed the line from considering individual experience into using experience as a deliberate stand-in for race to hit a racial outcome. Duke, at least implicitly, seems poised to argue it stayed on the legal side of that line. And that distinction, proxy versus factor, intent versus outcome, is going to be the central battle not just for Duke, but for every selective school in the country. My take, and I'll be careful to keep it about the reasoning rather than picking your side for you. The thing to watch is the difference between outcome and intent. A statistic like a black applicant was 3.5 times more likely to be admitted than a comparable Asian applicant is a striking outcome. But an outcome alone doesn't prove intent, because lots of things correlate with race without being designed to. What moves this from outcome to intent is the DOJ's claim that it has internal documents and instructions showing Duke deliberately set out to, in their phrasing, preserve racial outcomes. If those documents say what the DOJ says they say, that's a serious problem for Duke. If they're more ambiguous than the press release suggests, and press releases are advocacy documents, not neutral summaries, then this is a much closer call. So my honest advice, be skeptical of anyone on either side who tells you this is obvious. Read the actual findings when they're public. Weigh Duke's actual response, and resist letting your politics fill in the evidence you haven't seen yet. That caution cuts in both directions, and it should. All right, let me take you from a courtroom fight about the present to a genetic inheritance from deep in the past, and end on the one that, for a lot of you watching, is literally personal, because this last study might be written into your own DNA. Neanderthals, our extinct cousins, generally shorter than us but noticeably more robust, stockier, stronger, with clear signs of large muscles on their bones. And a study just published in the journal Current Biology, led by Hugo Zeeberg of the Karolinska Institutet and Philip Canis of the Max Planck Institute, has found something remarkable. A specific gene we inherited from Neanderthals, through interbreeding around 47,000 years ago, appears to build more muscle in people living today, right now, in modern bodies. Here's the science, and it's a nice example of two totally different kinds of evidence pointing the same way. Growth hormone is the body's master signal for building muscle and bone. Your pituitary gland releases it. It travels through your blood, and it has to bind to a receptor on your cells to tell them to grow. The team found that the Neanderthal version of this growth hormone receptor has two tiny changes that most modern humans don't have. So they tested it. In the lab, they engineered cells to carry the Neanderthal receptor, hit them with growth hormone, and those cells responded more strongly, growing around 40% more than cells with the common modern version. That's the lab side. Then the population side. They looked at health and genetic data from more than 1.1 million adults across multiple biobanks, and found that people carrying the Neanderthal variant tend to have, on average, more muscle mass. Scientific American reported the figure at about 271 additional grams of muscle, with people who inherited it from both parents often having even more. It's rare to see lab evidence and population evidence line up this cleanly. And here's why I flagged this one as personal for a lot of you. This variant is not evenly spread around the world. It's most common in South and East Asian populations, carried by up to 24% of people in some parts of South Asia, compared to something like 0.5% in Europeans. So if your roots are in Asia, there's a real chance this ancient Neanderthal receptor is in you right now, quietly nudging your muscles. Now, you know what's coming, because you know this show. Let me pour some cold, critical water on the headline before it runs away from us, because the headlines writing themselves are Neanderthal gene makes you swole and muscle head DNA. And that framing is where honest science quietly gets strangled. Here are the three things that headline hides. First, the size of the effect. 271 grams. That is roughly the weight of a single apple. Across an entire adult body, that is a real, statistically detectable difference. And it is not going to be visible when you look in the mirror. Nobody is walking around noticeably jacked because of this gene. Second, and the researchers were wonderfully honest about this, the 40% number is from cells in a dish, not from your biceps. Cells in a lab growing 40% more is not the same as a person having 40% more muscle. Those are completely different scales, and conflating them is exactly how a modest finding becomes a viral lie. And third, my favorite quote from the whole study, from co-author Miriam Bereiter, who mentioned she does CrossFit. Even a Neanderthal growth hormone receptor, she said, is no substitute for training. That line is the whole story, honestly. Because the deeper point the senior author kept stressing is one worth carrying out of here. This is one gene among many, many genetic influences on the body. As Zeeberg put it, it can't explain the Neanderthal body type on its own, and it certainly doesn't determine what any individual person looks like, which is the necessary antidote to the ugliest way a study like this can be misused, as some kind of genetic ranking. My ancestry gives me better muscle genes. It's one receptor, worth about an apple, that does nothing without the gym. Genetics loads a possibility. Behavior is what fires it. So let me tie these three together, because they really are the same story wearing three costumes. On Venus, we're reading the shape of cracks to argue about an ocean we can't sample. At Duke, the government is reading the shape of documents to argue about an intent it can't directly see. And in our own DNA, scientists are reading the behavior of cells to argue about a strength we can barely measure. In all three, the honest scientists and the honest lawyers use words like consistent with, appears to, on average. And in all three, the headlines strip those words out and hand you a certainty nobody actually earned. So here's what I'll leave you with tonight. The most valuable skill you can have in 2026 is not knowing more facts. It's knowing the difference between evidence and proof, between a clue that points somewhere and a conclusion that's actually been nailed down. Venus might have had oceans. Duke might have deliberately discriminated. That gene might add a bit of muscle. Might. The people who tell you they're certain about the planet, about the lawsuit, about your DNA, are the ones to trust least. And the people carefully saying, here's what the evidence suggests, and here's what would prove it, are the ones quietly doing it right. It'll steer you truer than the certainty ever will.